Hello and welcome to New Energy Opportunities presented by Energy Voice in association with Bracewell. In addition to our principal partner, we are joined by accomplished guests from BP, Air Liquide, Equinor and Navigator CO2 Ventures. I am Ed Reed, I'm an editor at Energy Voice. And we are of course joined by our live audience. And if you're watching, please feel free to participate through the chat function and submit questions for the panel as we go along. In normal times, we would be holding this event in Houston as the worldwide energy industry prepares for its annual shindigs of OTC and NAPE. But the last couple of years having been what they are, we've gone virtual. But that does feel slightly fitting for an event looking at new opportunities. The world is increasingly looking at new ways to tackle energy consumption. Today, we're going to be looking at three in particular: offshore wind, carbon capture, utilization and storage, and hydrogen. Times have changed. It must be remembered, always times of opportunity. We know energy supply and demand is changing. Our task today is to get a bit of a feeling about where these lines might be leading. I suppose the US does seem to have been seen as a bit behind the curve in the past in taking up the shift to the energy transition, but it's clear that the pace of change is accelerating, driven both by the government and by companies who are really sort of plunging in really rather quickly. The Biden administration has set out ambitious plans, and while not everything is yet clear, companies are following suit. Offshore wind is the most noticeable instance of this. In May, the Vineyard Wind 1 plan was approved as the first large-scale project in the US. And as I'm sure we'll hear from Equinor and BP, more plans will be coming. The US has a head start in CCUS with more than 6,000 kilometers of pipelines transporting CO2. While expanding this knowledge is a challenge, and there's always the question of cost, it's clear that storing must play an important role in giving some industries a little more time to adjust. Hydrogen is a known substance and one used in a number of processes, but the challenge here will be in scaling up low carbon production. And I suppose one of the questions here is how costs can fall for hydrogen, particularly from renewable energy. The government recently set the target of producing hydrogen from green sources for $1 per kilogram in 10 years' time. That's down from around $5 now. So there's a bit of a challenge ahead of us. I think I'm going to take this opportunity to ask our speakers to introduce themselves, and then we'll move into questions. So first, I'd like to ask Stephen Hugg, partner at Bracewell.
Thanks, Ed. My name is Stephen Hugg. I'm a partner in Bracewell's Washington, D.C. office. My practice focuses on representing energy companies, primarily generation developers, before state and federal agencies. And I have been very involved in offshore wind in particular, and have worked quite a bit on the New York solicitation process and related programs and requirements. So very happy to be here.
Thanks, Stephen. And next, Liz McGinley, also from Bracewell.
Thanks, Ed. My name is Liz McGinley. I am a tax partner in the New York office of Bracewell. I have a broad federal transactional tax practice advising on M&A transactions, joint ventures, financings of different types. And in the last 15 years, I've spent focused entirely on the energy industry. In the last 2 years, I have focused much more on the area of CCUS, particularly the federal tax credits that are available under Section 45Q for carbon capture, utilization, and storage projects. And I'm also very lucky to work together with a great team at Bracewell, also focused on CCUS, covering other important aspects, including environmental, contractual matters, policy issues, land rights, and IP, and very happy to be working with Navigator on their very high-profile transaction in the CCUS space.
Fantastic. Richard Haydock, Project Director for the ENBW BP offshore wind projects in the UK Irish Sea.
Thanks, Ed, and great to be here today. I'm probably an example of the energy transition in progress. I've recently shifted across from oil and gas into offshore wind. And previously in my career, I've also worked on a carbon capture and storage project as well. So really great to join the panel today and looking forward to an active discussion.
Dave Edwards, Director and Advocate for Hydrogen Energy, Air Liquide.
Thank you, Ed. My name is Dave Edwards. I work in the leadership team for the hydrogen energy part of Air Liquide within North America. We have a lot of transitions happening in hydrogen, as you already referred, and a strong tie to offshore wind and CCS processes. It'll be an interesting panel discussion to see where hydrogen interconnects with these broad topics.
And Anders Hangeland, Vice President, Equinor Wind US.
Thanks, Ed. My name is Anders Hangeland. I head up Equinor's offshore wind projects in the US. That's Empire and Beacon Wind off the coast of New York. So glad to be invited. Thanks.
And finally, Matt Vining, CEO, Navigator CO2 Ventures.
Thank you, Ed, and good day to everyone. First, want to say thank you to Bracewell, our friends there, for organizing this event. Just as rich DNA stems from crude oil midstream development, and so we are part of this very robust transition that's occurring, and very excited for the conversation today.
Fantastic, and I think those brief introductions give you a real flavour of the way in which the energy transition is occurring, in that sort of move from I guess within all of our DNA of sort of oil and gas into these new opportunities. I mean, it seems like setting out the rules of the game is likely to dictate success, particularly in these sort of early stages. And given that, I feel maybe it's a good place to start with the role of government. Liz, maybe you could just shed a bit of light about how you think policies and regulations can sort of play a role in sort of nurturing these three sort of technologies.
Sure, absolutely. Let me start in talking about CCUS, particularly when it drew a lot of attention with the government support for these projects in the form of the federal tax credit under Section 45Q. It's a very valuable credit. It was expanded in early 2018. It was made richer, and it's available for projects where you capture CO2 and store it underground in secure geological storage, inject it for enhanced oil or gas recovery, or utilize it for a purpose that sequesters the CO2 from the atmosphere. And that has had a huge incentive because a lot of these CCUS projects otherwise don't generate revenue. For example, a project that just captures CO2 from an industrial facility and stores it underground does not otherwise have a revenue source, so the credits are very important. But the structure of the credits is also important. It's not just important what the dollar amount of the credits are, but it's important for developers in all aspects of the industry, whether they're developing carbon capture equipment to add to their industrial facilities, whether they're building midstream assets to transport the CO2, storage facilities, or developing new technologies for utilization of CO2. It's important for all of them to have certainty and predictability around these federal incentives, whether it be the tax credit or whether it be other financing programs like DOE loans that are available. In order to get approval for these projects internally, in order to understand the value they provide to the company, and also to be able to get debt or equity financing for these projects, certainty is very important. So I think as a policy matter, what we hope to see as Section 45Q and the administrative guidance around it continues to evolve, we hope to see greater certainty, perhaps things such as converting the credit to a direct pay option, so they remove the complexity of trying to monetize these credits, pushing out the start of construction date, so you remove the uncertainty as to how quickly you can get a project into service, and also perhaps removing threshold capture requirements, and also the certainty of the rates of the credits, and maybe extend the availability of the credits so taxpayers have a greater picture of the value of the incentives to them long term, so they can make current business decisions.
Thanks, Liz. And Dave, I'm going to take this to you as well. I mean, I think, obviously that kind of question about removing uncertainty seems, I guess, that's sort of at the heart of what government can do. How do you see the US sort of helping drive that sort of hydrogen picture?
So I think in all of our cases, whether it's hydrogen or offshore wind or CCS, everything has to come to scale, because scale is what's going to make the differences we want to make, and scale is what's going to bring the cost down to be effective. And so those policies that enable scale are going to be most critical. And if we think about energy transformations in the US, scale really comes from private investment. Private investment follows exactly as we've heard, with opportunities that are viable, with opportunities that are long-term, with the ability to make stable investments. In all of our cases, we're looking at capital investments that need to remain active for decades in order for them to have the appropriate scale that we need to solve the problem. So the role that government can really play is establishing those markets, de-risking some of those early investments, and promoting private investment into the capital and into the operation of these as we think about market development.
Sure, and Richard, I'm gonna take this question to you as well, as someone with sort of that sort of expertise in I suppose both the US and that sort of the UK sort of experience. I mean, talking about that sort of the way to scale, I suppose, is kind of key. Obviously, as Dave was saying, for hydrogen, but obviously also for offshore wind, and clearly the US seems to be really sort of focusing on expanding its offshore wind hopes. How do you see the government playing a role in that part?
I mean, the certainty piece is one that is critical. If we look at some of the lessons that we've seen in Europe, processes around things like the contract for difference that's been very successful in the UK, which has enabled companies to have confidence that there is a method by which they can get a reasonable price. And that really supports the investment decisions and the ability of companies to get the financing that they require. And that brings entrance into the market. If there's a certainty on price that can be achieved, it means that you can look at companies that can come in looking at both project financing and also equity financing. And what we've seen in Europe is both smaller companies and larger kind of multinationals come into the wind business. And I think that's really encouraging, and it's important that we're able to do that in the US potentially as well. Over the scale of the US projects, the fact that many of them are very large in scale means that may be a bit more challenging. I think the other area that governments can really make a difference is on things like consenting and permitting processes. And again, the more certainty, the more clarity there is around those processes, so that developers know exactly what they need to do. They know how their applications are going to be reviewed. They know the key things, the evidence that they need to gather, how stakeholders are going to be managed through that process. These sorts of things make a big difference as well as you're looking at the sort of investments that we need to make in offshore wind.
Fantastic. And Stephen, I'm gonna come to you. I mean, I think you mentioned in your introduction your sort of participation in that sort of the New York process, and I suppose that's also the other part of the puzzle. And obviously, we sort of tend to possibly sort of focus on sort of the role of the federal government, but I think that there's clearly this role that the states have to play in that. And maybe you could just shed a little bit of light on what states can or are doing in order to help sort of drive developments.
Sure. And I think in the offshore wind sector, the states have been doing a tremendous amount. Richard referenced the contracts for differences that we've seen in the UK. I think in the States, we have a number of states that really have been making a concerted effort to de-risk the development of offshore wind projects by providing certainty through either providing offtake agreements, through competitive solicitation processes to developers that are selected, or by approving applications by offshore wind developers to receive compensation for ORECs. Those types of programs are, I think, playing an important role in driving the growth of offshore wind that we are seeing, and is happening quite quickly. So I think that the states in that regard deserve quite a bit of credit. What can they do on top of that? I think much like we've seen permitting uncertainty at the federal level, I think there continue to remain roadblocks along the way to development at the state level that could be cleared. I think establishing a single permitting process that is led by a single agency, and that limits the ability of individual localities to sort of stand in the way of project development. Those types of regulatory reforms can have a positive impact on the ability of projects to get to market quicker and more efficiently. And I think it is something that the states are taking a look at, and some states have already taken steps to try to address those issues.
Just to pick you up on that last point about the difference between the states. I mean, obviously, I suppose they're all going to move in at different speeds. But are you seeing some states leading the way? Are there sort of examples that can be kind of aspired to or looked up to?
Yeah, I think we've seen a number of states in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region in particular sort of leading the way. I mean, certainly New York, New Jersey have made the development of offshore wind a important policy priority for the state. New York has selected a number of projects. They've conducted 2 solicitations, and at this point have committed or have selected several gigawatts of offshore wind. New Jersey is not far behind. And we also see Maryland and Massachusetts that have really focused quite a bit on offshore wind. And we see other states starting to consider what they can do to promote offshore wind using slightly different models. But, I think Virginia over the last year or two has been focused on promoting offshore wind development. So I think what we're seeing is a number of states that really did take a leading role, and but increasingly, I think there's a broader array of states that are interested in promoting the development of offshore wind, and I think that will likely increase as we see additional lease areas become available and begin being developed.
Fantastic. And Anders, I'm going to take this to you. I mean, obviously, as you know, as you said, you're deeply involved in those sort of hands-on experience with sort of wind projects. I mean, what do you see? Do you see sort of states or the sort of the federal government as sort of being, I suppose, a critical part of how you operate?
Well, I think it's clear that both of them are critical. I mean, just to put it a bit into context, the 30 gigawatt 2030 goal of the Biden administration is roughly equivalent to the installed capacity that's available in the world today. So the next 10 years, there's a massive ambition on the federal side. And then I think, as Stephen pointed out, some of the key development in terms of realizing this is also coming from the states, and solicitations, as Stephen mentioned, is a key parameter of that. Also the permitting part, and in addition, as we've seen with New York and our partner NYSERDA, and of course also with BP that we're collaborating with, actually bringing a supply chain and local manufacturing jobs and economic development to the state is an important parameter and part of that.
And is there anything that's on your wish list that would, obviously you mentioned that 30 gigawatt goal, which sounds like quite a lot to begin with. I mean, is there anything that's on your wish list that you think would help sort of materially advance that?
Well, I think it's back to what this panel sort of have already started diving into, right? We talked about stable frame conditions. We talked about improving frame conditions, the ITC, direct pay as a part of that, more lease areas, obviously. And then I think it's important to remind ourselves that this industry is sort of just getting started, right? So actually being able to deliver on the projects that currently have one-off take agreements and are able to start installing wind turbines out in the ocean is about realizing that.
Fantastic. And Matt, I'm going to bring you in at this point. Obviously, I suppose as I sort of mentioned in my opening remarks, obviously the US has got an incredible expertise in sort of transporting and handling CO2. Do you think that that sort of responsibility to help develop lies with state governments, or does the federal government also have a role to play?
Well, I think that ultimately it's a shared responsibility, and I think that there's a bit of catching up frankly around CCS and CCUS project development relative to offshore wind, where the states are now deploying various task force to investigate ways to, I'll say, minimize the roadblocks associated with, say, pipeline siting permits, which in the absence of federal guidelines around CO2 pipeline siting, it's deferred to the states. And so in our project specifically, we traverse 5 states, so we are going to take on that process 5 times individually. So we do see that there is efficiency gain by, creating, I'll say, a common thread at the federal level that can then be monitored and governed by the states. But I think providing a consistent framework to operate in certainly lowers the barriers on the development for the aspect of a project like that. I don't think you can ignore the importance of the sequestration side. And in our case, the state of Illinois, is investigating and evaluating, how to properly govern, even though federal EPA oversees the Class 6 permitting process, ways to deploy efficiently and safely, their geologic resources that are most conducive for CO2. So I do think it's a balanced approach that should be led at the federal level and then monitored at the state level to make projects such as ours, more efficiently developed.
Fantastic. Yeah, sure. And Richard, I'm just going to come back to you just for a final point on my sort of policy sort of areas. Obviously with your sort of insights from beyond the US, are there other things that the US could look to adopt that might help accelerate these areas of change? I mean, obviously, there are these sort of 3 opportunities that we're looking at. Are there ways in which the state or federal governments can help sort of drive that change by taking learnings from overseas?
I think one of the things I'd highlight there is the connectivity of these 3 technologies. Hydrogen effectively sits in the middle. You have green or blue hydrogen. So if you're going to go with blue hydrogen, you're probably going to need carbon sequestration. If you're going to go with green hydrogen, you probably need offshore wind. And one of the things it's important that both the federal government and state governments look at is, are the rules, the guidelines, the processes, the permitting that they're putting in place, does it make sense when you look across multiple technologies? And are we making it as simple as possible for companies to put those, a hydrogen project with a carbon capture project together, or an offshore wind project with a hydrogen, a green electrolyzer, and making sure that there isn't unnatural boundaries between them. So the point that Stephen made earlier about looking at how you can have a single permitting process that covers a whole project, that can make a massive difference. And that's certainly one of the lessons from the UK, where a few years back they looked at the permitting processes, and then they created 4 projects which they considered to be nationally significant. They created a single permitting process that pulls all the different government agencies together into one process. And I think that is one of the game changers here. And the more that can be done, the more that it will enable the connectivity that ultimately is probably going to deliver the maximum value here, both for the country and also for developers and investors.
Sure. Liz, I'm going to come back to you. I mean, I think obviously, we were talking about this sort of way in which to kind of create a sort of a receptive, playing ground for large scale plans. Are there lessons that developers should bear in mind when taking this leap straight into the big leagues? I mean, going from a bit of a standing start to the sort of the major plans that we're seeing develop.
Yes, it's somewhat amazing that while CCUS is generally in its early stages in the United States, we have seen some big projects take off in the last several months. So people are willing to make very large investments in these projects. And, just kind of reiterating the theme, I think what's very important is to give them a sense of a low execution risk, that all of the governmental approvals can be obtained in a timely fashion. All of the government incentives can be achieved under the terms that currently exist, or that they will be enhanced, but in a predictable way. So we've been impressed by the large undertakings people are willing to make right now, but that also requires a tremendous amount of capital, which goes back to the requirement of certainty. And not only economic certainty, but also timing certainty. One of the challenges in the CCUS space is the EPA permitting process for secure geological storage. And in some states that have primacy, that's in the state's jurisdiction. But right now, we know that federal and state officials are trying to get their hands around the very great complexity of secure geological storage and how to rapidly assess whether a project is viable, what guardrails need to be put up, the monitoring process. And that's very time consuming because, like everyone else, they're on a learning curve. So what will be very important is that process proceeds very quickly so the federal agencies can give timely feedback to these projects so they can start construction and continue on their timeline.
Fantastic. And Anders, I'm going to take this to you as well. I mean, as said, you're sort of trying to get sort of a number of plates sort of spinning at the same time. Did you have any kind of concerns jumping into that process? Going from a sort of a small start to a sort of a sort of gigawatt scale plans.
Well, I guess for us as a company, I mean, we both own, operate, and market from wind farms in Europe, right? And it's about for us bringing this expertise and technology into the US. And of course, as we discussed, and there are many topics that we're sort of touching in upon here, it's about how can we sort of bring the learnings and the technology into the US and improve on that. So I think your reflection on the large scale is a good one, right? Because in Europe we spent almost a decade getting to the gigawatts projects, and now in the US we're jumping straight into it. So we certainly are in the big leagues from the get-go.
And in terms of your ambitions, what do you? How can you maybe you could just set out briefly what Equinor is hoping to do?
Well, as our company, we have an ambition of sort of getting to 12 to 16 gigawatts on an equity basis within the end of the century. So that's a big one. In the US in particular, we have obviously almost 15% of the Biden administration's goal. So we are keen to get that off the ground and get that installed, and then see the prospect of offshore wind not only being on paper but also in active production. So that's what we're actively working towards, together with obviously BP and the rest of our partners.
And Dave, I think it's the hydrogen sort of often seems sort of the bit of a wild card, but I suppose in terms of scaling up, obviously we're seeing a number of projects being announced around the world. What do you think that people should bear in mind when they're sort of taking this major leap forwards?
So I think there's a couple things, and this is one of the places where hydrogen might be a little bit different than our other two topics, and that is we tend to start out in the transportation sector. When you have low carbon hydrogen available, the most obvious place, the most needed place for it is generally in transportation in a fuel cell, for example. In California, we've got 10,000 light duty vehicles. Around the US, there are on the order of 40,000 warehousing vehicles that are already using hydrogen, for example, and we're starting to see the transition from demonstrations to real deployment of things like fuel cell buses and fuel cell trucks. So our starting point is a little bit different in that we're looking at transportation sectors. But as we grow that market and as we start to make the investments in the hydrogen production that's necessary for those markets, we start to have this interconnectedness with the rest of the energy grid. Needing electricity for electrolysis-based hydrogen means tying into onshore and offshore wind as well as solar capabilities. And then looking at our existing assets. In the US, we already produce, we as an industry already produce about 10,000 tons per day of hydrogen based on essentially natural gas transformation. We need to look at deployment of carbon capture into those production fields in order to reduce the carbon of the hydrogen that's already available, and then to think about how do we integrate new renewable hydrogen assets into that? How do we tie the Gulf Coast production facilities into these potential new investments that are coming from wind and solar onshore and offshore? So our first investments tend to be focused around transportation, and our future investments are where we start to have this interconnectedness into the local energy systems. And that's where the projects really become big and complex. In many ways, enabling the offshore wind to have an off-taker for storage at the hundreds of gigawatt hour level, for example, and our need for things like carbon capture technology in order to continue to enable the assets that we've already invested in to continue to produce what would now be low carbon hydrogen, for example.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me like there are all these sort of, I suppose not just developers sort of thinking about sort of a number of sort of moving a number of projects forwards, but also I suppose the industry as a whole sort of trying to get all these parts sort of moving together. Matt, just obviously on that sort of hydrogen note, do you think that the industry, the CCS, CCUS industry is sort of ready to scale up to, help sort of drive forward that low carbon sort of, in Europe, blue hydrogen? Is the industry ready?
I think from an infrastructure perspective, we're certainly to use a baseball analogy, we're kind of in the first inning of being prepared to scale up to handle these different commodities. But as we've seen, pipeline infrastructure is an effective tool in being able to provide these solutions at scale. I think in order to get there, though, going back to something that Liz was alluding to earlier, and to kind of put it into context for our project specifically, is in order to make this project happen, it took the unique intersection of, BlackRock is the financial sponsor for Navigator, so the largest manager in the world, one of the largest refiners in the world, and an execution party in Navigator with a cost profile and an execution acumen to make a project like this economically possible. And in the absence of the three legs of the stool, it's very difficult to see how projects like this can get built, both in terms of navigating the uncertainty associated with the execution risk, but also the financeability of projects like this. So I do think that infrastructure developers such as Navigator, and there are many in the midstream space, are ready to provide those solutions. But it takes the intersection of all of the entire value chain in order to move forward with I think the build out that is necessary to accomplish the political and societal objectives that we're all discussing and aspiring to. Even on our scale, we talk about being in the big leagues. 10 million metric tons, 15 million metric tons, which is directionally where we see the scope of our project, is a rounding error in terms of where we need to get to. And as I talk about being in the first inning, this is the first project, amongst many multiples of projects that ultimately need to be developed. And so we see reduce costs and reduce those barriers in order to facilitate the kind of build out that I think would be conducive to bridge all these value chain gaps. But I think the industry is ready to approach it constructively.
Obviously, you sort of spoke about that sort of, I suppose, combination of factors that have made your sort of story possible. Do you think that that's going to change as the industry matures, or is that going to be a sort of a longer term issue?
I mean, unfortunately, I certainly hope that it's easier for the folks after us, in terms of being able to execute these projects. For Navigator's purposes and for our customers, it's about doing this, even though it's within, I would say, the framework of a more complex, regulatory dynamic. It's about doing this the right way, and positioning the company, the asset, and the infrastructure really more focused on what's to come instead of what we know now. And so when we think about this and we talk about this blended mixture of state regulation, federal regulation, and we say, okay, well, in pipelines in our world, it really revolves around what's best practices from FERC's perspective, even though they don't currently assert jurisdiction over CO2 pipelines. Well, that's why we've adopted the common carrier model, because we believe, as super regional or national infrastructure buildouts ultimately are accomplished vis-a-vis kind of more regulatory certainty to de-risk execution, but also economic certainty through the various elements that Liz alluded to earlier, to be able to build networks or be a part of that construction in the future, because that's ultimately where we see this as going. and we hope that with the kind of the centralization of regulatory reform, it paves the way for that substantial build up, because ultimately that's what's necessary to provide the scale of solution that is necessary to provide economic solutions for our customers.
Sure. And Stephen, I'm gonna come to you next. I mean, I think, obviously we have a tendency, I suppose, or I have a tendency, perhaps, to look at these sort of big projects and think that sort of demonstrates progress and change. But I suppose also, I mean, there is that question of sort of connections, isn't there? Power grids, pipelines, things like that. Are we as an industry paying enough attention to those sort of crucial interconnections?
No, I would say, at least on the power side, from the
Yeah.
offshore wind developer side, I would say no. Now, to be fair, I think it is an issue that's getting much more attention as of late. But, I think it's pretty well known throughout the industry that right now the interconnection process and the existing policies that FERC has adopted respecting the allocation of costs associated with interconnection are a major stumbling block for renewable developers more generally. The grid as it's currently, or the interconnection process as it's currently set up, is really built on the idea that if you are a developer and you are interconnecting to the grid, you should be basically required to pay whatever costs the transmission provider identifies, without regard to the impact that upgrade or that build out will have on the broader grid and the benefits that will flow from the development and expansion of the grid, as well as your project coming online. And so when you think about offshore wind in particular, where you have projects that, number one, have a limited set of interconnection points that are available to them because they are, geographically constrained to their lease area. They're oftentimes significant development along the coast or environmentally sensitive areas. There are offshore wind developers are in the unfortunate position of having sort of a limited range of points of interconnection, often which would involve the incurrence of hundreds of millions of dollars in interconnection costs. Now, I do think it's an issue that is, like I said, getting more attention. FERC issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking last month that is proposing to take a holistic look at the interconnection process and the relationship between the process that is used by the grid operators to expand the grid more generally, to try to ensure a more equitable allocation of costs. I think if that initiative results in meaningful reforms, I think that would have a positive impact on offshore wind and renewables more generally. And then I think there also needs to be sort of a movement towards greater accountability. Right now the interconnection process is really driven or conducted by the market operators, PJM, ISO New England, NISO, other similar organizations. And I think what we've seen across the country really is significant delays. All of these interconnection processes include rules, including timelines for studies to be complete. And those timelines in practice are unenforceable. And so I do think there also needs to be a movement towards requiring those that are responsible for conducting studies to conduct those studies promptly and make sure that they're providing developers with a timely, accurate, upfront estimate of costs.
Sure. Richard. I mean, I hear offshore wind is in an unfortunate position. Do you share that concern?
I think that depends where you are, to a certain extent. I mean, the grid connection piece is fascinating, and certainly I think it's fair to look at an offshore wind development almost as two separate projects. One project being the array, the turbines itself, and the second project being the cable to shore, substations associated with that, and ultimately the grid connection. And in different parts of the world, there's different strategies that have been taken around that. So some of the European countries, for example, they've actually developed offshore grids, and as a developer, you get an offshore connection point, which in some cases is actually awarded to you with your lease. So that that really makes it much simpler as a developer. In other countries, that is a process that is being considered, and there are changes in the UK. There's a consultation going on in the UK which is looking at some of that. And from what Stephen said, I don't think in the US you'll go that far, but there could be more, a more thoughtful process to enable grid connection. But it is certainly one of the key points in the development timeline, and one that if it isn't made simple and clear, has the potential to significantly delay the project. And again, it comes back to this point of certainty. If the grid connection is a major point of uncertainty, then you're not able to proceed through your consenting process. It makes financing processes difficult, etc. So grid connection is a key point, definitely a really important factor for offshore wind.
Sure. And Dave, I suppose hydrogen is I suppose a little bit different, but also a little bit the same, right? I mean, I think obviously countries with gas grids are sort of facing up to the opportunities, I suppose, of either blending hydrogen or sort of pure hydrogen grids. What do you see the future of transmission for hydrogen being?
So I think if I do a play on words with the word interconnectedness, we mean something entirely different, and that is now connectedness between hydrogen and these new energy vectors. Historically, we were very strongly tied to refining industries and agricultural industries, but now we're tied strongly to transportation industries and energy generation and energy storage. And that kind of interconnectedness means entirely new customers, entirely new partners, entirely new directions that we need to be able to work. And I think that's one of the really critical parts of hydrogen is not focusing on sort of single applications, but thinking about how broadly a hydrogen molecule can be used in the energy sector. It can be used for storage off of the grid. It can be used in some ways to help decarbonize natural gas systems. And so as we think about connection to the grid, getting value for grid management, for grid storage, redeploying those molecules back onto the grid through production or redeploying that to other sectors such as transportation, and then redeployment and connection between the electric grid through electrolysis and the natural gas grid, either through production or through injection into the grid. All of these are new vectors for the hydrogen industry as a whole. So every time we're interfacing with these new applications, it means we need to develop that regulatory interface and that business engagement interface that allows us to proceed.
Sure. I suppose that question of those opportunities, those three opportunities, kind of working together, is a kind of like a really interesting aspect of this discussion. I'm just coming to you, Liz. I mean, what are your thoughts about ways in which these three areas may or may not be able to work together? Are they moving in the same at the same pace in the same direction?
Well, obviously, the most clear connection is between hydrogen and CCUS. If you can add CCUS to the traditional hydrogen production with natural gas, you can significantly decarbonize it and create blue hydrogen, which is going to be a significant category, which offers a significant opportunity for growth, especially given that in combination with the availability of gas in the United States. But in terms of going back to the point of interconnectedness, not just interconnectedness between these three energy transition topics, but how it has evolved in the CCUS industry was very interesting to see very early on in my practice with CCUS. I was working with industrial emitters of CO2 who were talking about either building their own secure geological storage facilities or purchasing them that are near the industrial facility. And very quickly, we saw the industry kind of bring in the greatest expertise in each segment of CCUS as it exists right now. We saw midstream companies that were very strong in, traditional oil and gas midstream transport quickly come into the space and try to offer their services as part of the carbon capture transition. Also, those with storage expertise, those with properties that were very well suited for EOR and understanding subsurface geology, came in very quickly to try to fill in the gap of providing secure geological storage services as an entirely separate industry that we didn't see before. And what's very interesting now is we're seeing all of these experts and large businesses in the different categories, whether it be ethanol refining, which can add CCUS both for the 45Q credits as well for the LCFS benefits, coming to the table to participate in the CCUS industry. We see major midstream companies, which we historically saw in the oil and gas space, MLP companies, moving in to be providing transport services to this industry because that's their true expertise. And then those with the true understanding of subsurface geology, even those with a great understanding of subsurface offshore, which is another opportunity for storage of CO2 underground, coming together, bringing to bear their greatest talents as part of the whole value stream of reducing CO2 emissions through CCUS.
Fantastic. And Dave, I'm going to bring this one to you. We've got a question from the audience. It's from Alvaro Robledo. Apologies if I've mangled your name. It says the large US oil companies are focusing on a combination of CCS and blue hydrogen production, but Stanford and Cornell have concluded that blue hydrogen is 5 times worse than natural gas because of the resulting emissions. How do you think that the blue hydrogen can make its case in the industry at a time when we're sort of thinking about those emission problems?
Well, I think that the biggest advantage that blue hydrogen has is the ability to scale and ability to scale quickly. We already have very large hydrogen production facilities for things like refining and ammonia production, as I mentioned earlier. And if we can add carbon capture to those and help decarbonize those pathways, we can do it at scale and leverage the billions of dollars of investment that have already been there. At the same time, the next generation investments need to look at those pathways and say, what are the right appropriate investments in low carbon and high capacity? Keep in mind that the market needs it to be low cost, it needs to be low carbon, and it needs to be reliable, and it needs to be available in the locations. And that might be a different equation in different parts of the country. What you're able to do in the Northwest with excess hydro, for example, what you're able to do in California, what you're able to do in the Gulf Coast, as far as resources to produce the hydrogen and deployment into markets could be very, very different. So I think the way to think about blue hydrogen is a way to bridge between our existing invested assets to do it at scale and to do it in a way that we know is reliable and we know is low cost. As far as the carbon footprint of that process, I think that the policies that are most effective are those that look at the well-to-wheel evaluation of carbon intensity or other carbon processes and appropriately value lower and lower carbon methods. If blue carbon is not as low carbon as the other methods, then it shouldn't be rewarded in the same fashion. But it absolutely will play a role in getting us to scale and getting us to scale quickly.
Sure. And Matt, I'm going to take this to you as well. I mean, obviously, we have seen some concerns around CCUS. I think last month Chevron in Australia, there were some worries around its abilities to store emissions from one of its LNG projects. I mean, how can you what's your response to those sort of concerns around CCS and capturing those emissions?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one certainly that we get it a lot from all stakeholders. I think that it really starts with from a midstream company's perspective and something that Liz said. I think it's embracing what you do well and what you're an expert in, and then aligning yourself with best-in-class experts who are proficient in areas of the overall execution. And so our version of that is that we've aligned ourselves with a combination of Tenaska and Advanced Resource International that have extensive expertise in the subsurface analysis, the monitoring process associated with our contemplated scope. I think what you can read into what occurred in Australia is it's location with respect to geology. You can't substitute good geology, other geographies. So I think it all starts there, and then I do believe that process that the EPA has put in place around the rigorous process that the EPA has in place around the Class 6 permit is appropriate for understanding how the scope of injecting CO2 and how it naturally migrates over time, and the monitoring that's associated with that. It's precisely the reason why that process takes many months, a couple of years on the front end, and while there's decades of monitoring that's required over the injection period and over the monitoring period. So we do believe that you can certainly accomplish this objective safely and at scale, but it does come down to the ultimate geology associated with where the ejection is occurring, and ensuring that your scope is appropriate for the rate of injection and longevity that you expect to operate. But we do believe that there are many examples where this has been done safely and can continue to be done safely in the future.
Sure. And Anders, I'm going to come to you next. I mean, I think we've talked about you talked about, I think, the way in which the supply chain has to evolve. And I wonder, is that a question of sort of support from the market, from financiers, or is that a regulatory thing? How best can that develop?
Well, I think it's clear at least when we talk about offshore wind, I mean, a large part of the supply chain is not there at the moment, right? So how to bring this sort of into play? And I think, at least for us, New York provides a valid example in terms of how this can be done. They've provided mechanisms and incentives for developers to bring facilities and supply chain into the state. And two of sort of the examples that we're particularly proud of is at the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal and at the Port of Albany. The South Brooklyn Marine Terminal is our O&M base for the projects that we are developing, and is being sort of transformed into a state-of-the-art assembly facility in addition. And up at Albany, the Port of Albany development that we have together with Marmon and Welcon, we are creating the first offshore wind tower manufacturing facility in the US. So I think through the solicitations that New York has provided, that has provided a climate where developers, the supply chain developers, and obviously the state can come together and realize this. And if I were a supplier, I think what I would be looking at is, obviously, you need scale, you need the frame conditions, and you need support mechanisms. And that's actually about seeing that once you made the investments, that your port or your development or your manufacturing facility is predictably being filled with more and more projects, so that you have a longevity to your investment. So I think that's some of the experiences that we've had.
Sure, and just to sort of follow up on that, I mean, I suppose the phrase energy transition is obviously sort of bandied around a lot, and obviously as sort of mentioned at the beginning, we're pretty much all sort of from that sort of oil and gas background. Do you see there being opportunities for, I suppose, traditional hydrocarbon sort of service providers moving into this space? Are there opportunities in that way, or is it a different set of skills?
No, I think there's definitely opportunities, and I mean, you need to almost dive into the different components. Obviously, if you look at the wind turbine generator, then you have very discrete offshore wind suppliers in Vestas, GE, and Siemens Gamesa. But if you look a bit beyond that, then a lot of the suppliers that we're using in oil and gas are also applicable in offshore wind. So I think many of the same skill sets are being deployed and are deployable also in offshore wind. And then, of course, you have new suppliers coming into this industry with a different background, and of course that's also tremendously exciting.
Sure. And Stephen, I'm going to take the same question to you. What's your thought about the sort of support in that supply chain?
Well, I think Anders did a great job of summarizing it. I mean, I referenced sort of state support for offshore wind, state solicitation processes. And, if you just take a step back and look at what the states have been doing, certainly they are committed to reducing carbon emissions, bring renewable energy on the grid. But, ultimately those programs are designed to encourage developers to come up with ideas and make investments in the state to build out the supply chain. And I think, the examples that Anders highlighted are great examples of that. And, I do think that the states ultimately view themselves as, partnering with these developers in some sense to build out the supply chain. And I think, the states right now are in some respects competing really to be the home of the offshore wind industry, or at least ensure that major aspects of the supply chain are cited in their states. So I think the states and the developers are making tremendous investments in that regard.
Sure, sure. And Dave, I mean, looking at the sort of the hydrogen opportunities, do you see those as being room for sort of new entrants in that sort of supply chain area?
Yeah, without a doubt. In fact, not just in the supply chain, but in the entire energy management process. The hydrogen industry has been around for many decades, but the players have very much been the same in those industrial applications. But now we're looking at entirely new potential producers. We have grid operators who are looking at producing large electrolyzer systems. We have new technologies coming to play. Electrolyzers themselves are today in relatively small, what I would call boutique manufacturing facilities, and we need them to shift from tens of megawatts to hundreds of megawatts to gigawatts to hundreds of gigawatts of production capability. And that requires the same kind of scaling that we saw in other energy industries as they made similar transitions. So entirely new players in some of the supply chain side. From the operations side, there's a lot of overlap from a project perspective with what I would call the existing energy infrastructure related to oil and gas and petroleum, for example. And then the operators of things like pipelines and on-road distribution and on-sea distribution have a lot of similarities that we can leverage from. And if you build on top of that, the hydrogen industry itself, with more than 50 years of safe operation with hydrogen, means we need to leverage that expertise as well. And I think they form a fine nexus of capability between leveraging the existing capabilities we have and growing and developing these new to scales that we've never seen before.
And Richard, I mean, just looking at that kind of question about sort of finance and sort of investment, do you think that these new opportunities have an opportunity to bring in new sources of capital? I mean, I suppose we've over the last sort of couple of years we've seen people sort of investors becoming more wary, should we say, of sort of oil and gas investments, but at the same time becoming much more interested in sort of new areas. What's your thought about the way in which you can sort of maybe try and capture some of that, some of those new sources of cash?
I mean, there's definitely opportunities there, both from a developer perspective and also in the supply chain as well. There is money available. Many people are adjusting their portfolios and are specifically targeting, what's called ESG investment, environmental and social. And so that is becoming much more important globally. And that's a trend we see everywhere, including in the US. So if you have an opportunity, whether it is a development side or whether it's on the supply chain side, there is a source of funding there. But that requires you to think quite carefully about what your project is and how you're going to demonstrate that you are in compliance with that. So you do need to think broader than just the straight commercial opportunity or the financial benefit you're going to bring. And you need to think, as Anders, I think, kind of started to mention there, about, what is it that your project will do on the environment? Are there areas of environmental enhancement that will become, as a consequence of your project? You also need to think about the social impact. So, what is the social need of the area that you're going to operate in? What is it that those local communities that you will impact most want? Is it jobs? And if it's jobs, what type of jobs? Are they looking for kind of a large scale factory commitment? Of course, many locations globally would like to see that. Or are they looking for help with training? Are they looking for apprenticeships? Are there other industrial sectors that are really important to that particular community that need support? So if you're going to access some of these ESG type funds and look to perhaps certainly one of the biggest investment trends that's happening, it does require you as a developer or as a supply chain company that's looking for investment, think quite broadly around the offer that you make to the wider community, and how you're going to demonstrate that you're going to play a significant role in that community and make a difference to the lives of those individuals. And that can actually be key in unlocking some of the finance.
Maybe Matt, you could shed a bit of light on this. You mentioned BlackRock is participating in Navigator. I mean, maybe you could just sort of set out how that sort of ESG pressure or sort of support works for you.
Yeah, certainly BlackRock, substantial investor, broadly and very vocal about their ESG objectives and ESG specific ESG infrastructure focus for infrastructure fund vehicles, but also broadly across the organization. I think the thing to recognize, and one of the advantages we have, sponsors such as BlackRock, is that represents different pools of capital, and the reason why that's important is because, and as I'm sure as the other panelists, can certainly commiserate with, is there's different phases of each of these substantial projects. In our instance specifically, we'll have tens of millions of dollars out the door, pre-permit, and that lends itself to a different style of capital, ESG focused or otherwise, that has to have an economic return on a risk-adjusted basis for this period of time. And it kind of goes back to thematically, what Steve and Liz were talking about, is there is this opportunity for a blended role between private financing and public financing to help bridge this gap between when private markets and or public markets would naturally enter and finance these projects. So we do, of course, see an enormous appetite to participate in projects, like ours, because there isn't a single source or a single exposure that an investor can directly, find otherwise. But there's multiple phases where, depending upon what that bucket of capital's appetite is from a risk perspective, that their natural entry point could be early stage capital, it could be late stage capital. And that's a bit of the nuance and the complexity associated with building projects like this, is aligning yourself with those different sources across the life cycle of projects like ours, and frankly, any project, I think, in the space similar to ours.
Sure. And Richard, I'm going to come back to you. We had a question from the audience from Patrick Carney. How does the group see the US being able to find or provide a workforce with the necessary skills to support offshore wind?
I mean, that's probably for me one of the most exciting parts of this whole transformation. And I think it's something that is really, really important, and we need to make sure we do this bit well. We can't leave people behind. Through the transition, naturally there'll be some industrial sectors that will tail off, and there will be other industrial sectors that pick up. And what I think we want to do as a broader industry is make sure we create the opportunities for people to come with the transition and to make the change. And I think the US, you have a tremendous pool of very high skilled individuals across all of the sort of skill sets that are going to be required. Specifically, if we look at the transition in our company, we have people in oil and gas at the moment, which are retraining across. There's a lot of transferable skills, and I think that's across the industry. If you look at the likes of offshore wind, a lot of the marine skills, the offshore operation skills, subsea, many things that are pretty transferable relatively easily. Project management, my own discipline. Obviously, it doesn't make a great deal of difference whether you're developing an oil and gas project or an offshore wind project. The basics of project management come with it. what we need to do is look for that specific sectoral knowledge and make sure we give people the opportunity to come across with that. When you look at the supply chain, if you look at the sort of factories that will need to be built, the ports that will need to be reconstructed, all of that creates a lot of opportunity for jobs. And there will need to be structured programs, and I think perhaps that's another area where a public-private partnership approach might work well, working with the training colleges, universities, and making sure that we are identifying the courses that will need to be run, so that people have the skill sets. And also, I think looking in particular at kind of mid and later career individuals and making sure that there's the opportunity for them to make the transition as well, irrespective of what part of the industry they are at, whether they're engineers, whether they're technicians, whether they're providing some of the ancillary services. It's really important that we include everybody and we give everybody a chance to come across and transition. And there may be a period of time where people alternate between different industries. So, you might do a few years in oil and gas, then you might go into an offshore wind development, maybe you go and do some hydrogen. I do think that many of the skills we're talking here are complementary. But for me, this is one of the areas where I'm particularly passionate. And I want to make sure we do as much as we can to create as many opportunities as possible for people.
Sure. And Liz, I suppose sort of, following on from that point about the way in which I suppose the industry can keep and retain those sort of skilled workers, which clearly are needed. I suppose one of the problems that the oil and gas industry has often faced is that sort of cyclicality problem, isn't it? With the the sort of the booms and the busts, and obviously with the busts, obviously there is an impact on employment. And is there a chance that these new opportunities, hydrogen, offshore wind, CCS, is there a chance that this might provide a new trajectory? Is that we can maybe move away from that sort of boom and bust cycle into something that's a bit more sort of constant, and therefore may be able to keep that sort of those skilled workers maybe a little bit more easily?
Yes, I think that definitely will be the case. It's interesting because having been in the oil and gas industry for many years, it's interesting to see work go through cycles based on the economic cycles. There are times where we're doing a tremendous amount of work in project development and raising capital for oil and gas development, and then just followed a few years later by bankruptcies and workouts and restructuring in that same industry. And I think that cycle of ups and downs in the oil and gas industry, particularly at times when it is at a lull, have given investors that had previously focused on that industry a real opportunity to assess whether that's where they want to be long term or whether they want to diversify more, particularly into the energy transition opportunities. So, as I mentioned before, we are seeing players with historic expertise in critical aspects of CCUS, the midstream development, understanding subsurface geology. A lot of those people are coming from having studied the geology for oil and gas wells, for enhanced oil recovery using EOR. So there are a lot of very similar skill sets that understand subsurface technology, understand how to effectively transport gases and liquids and what the risks are. And also in the area of professionals, in the area of consultants, project development folks, legal expertise, accounting expertise. We're seeing a lot of these people pivot now to quickly learn the relevant issues, whether it's in our environmental team learning more about the permitting process for CCUS, or really digging in and understanding LCFS standards and how to document that and meet all of the requirements to have a strong economic projects in CCUS. So I see a real transition between those who are engaged in the oil and gas space, both from a geology standpoint, from a transportation standpoint, from understanding subsurface geology for storage purposes, all having translatable skills that can be deployed in the CCUS industry.
Fantastic. And Anders, I'm going to take the same question to you. What are your thoughts about, are we moving away from cycles? Is there a new route with new technologies?
Well, I think at least certainly we are at the verge of this industry. So I think it might be a bit too soon to talk about cycles. I think the wind will be blowing, and we continue to see more and more interest in offshore wind. So I think that's not cyclical in the near term. I think perhaps more in terms of the components needed to support this, right? I think supply chain is that able to be developed in the proper manner to support the build out, and of course sort of the scale of this, will that continue in the trajectory? But I don't necessarily see a cyclicality in this, and I think as Richard pointed out, it is important that when we get more people to work in this fantastic industry, that it proves as a long-term opportunity as well, and not something that sort of goes away in a couple of years. So I think that's the area that I'm looking at.
Sure. And Dave, I've got a question here from the audience, from David Hugg. It's what is the panel's estimate for how much blue or green hydrogen would increase electricity prices over natural gas?
Well, that's a very complex question, and one that we're probably a ways away from having good understandings of. One of the important aspects of that question is that it strongly ties between the natural gas and electric grid in ways that a lot of other energy sectors don't. And it does it by bringing in the transportation sector. So 3 of the very biggest energy sectors in the US, which in some ways were disconnected in the past, hydrogen becomes an interconnected part of that. And so the best answer I can give is that the 3 will be more strongly connected than they had been in the past. The cost of fuel in the form of hydrogen will be closely tied to the cost of electricity and closely tied to the availability of either blue hydrogen or renewable natural gas to produce renewable hydrogen in ways that we hadn't seen before. If I go back to the previous question about cyclicality, for example, when we reach a more mature market phase, the cycles might be driven by something entirely different than what we see today. Geopolitical activities around the globe are less likely to influence a hydrogen vector because it's almost certainly in the first few generations going to be domestically produced, for example. The cycles are much more likely in the short term to be tied to things like government policy and government support during this growth sector and the ability to interconnect these different energy vectors than it is by the cycles that are driving, I would say, the refinery and oil and gas industries today.
Sure. There's a related question, which I suppose also sort of ties a lot of this discussion together, which is about who picks up the bill. Do consumers? Are we looking at higher power prices, at higher prices at the pump, or is the federal government, state government, who's going to take on that kind of cost burden? Stephen, let's take it to you. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, certainly in the power markets, we have competitive markets for power, right? At least at the wholesale level, and then retail markets vary. I think cost is an issue that will need to be tackled. I don't know that anything that we're talking about, however, necessarily translates into higher power prices. And I think in the long-term dynamics really remain to be seen, and everyone has different estimates. But we're sort of in an interesting period of transition, to state the obvious, where we're seeing an influx of new resources coming online, offshore wind, storage, at the same time that we're seeing greater efforts to promote energy efficiency, but then also a greater need for electricity, right? As we move, as we see a growth in electrification and greater use of electric cars and other technologies. So I'm sure that there are others that are far more qualified to talk about the long-term pricing trends. But I think ultimately, what we've seen over time is that a competitive market ultimately is the most efficient sort of means to determine how costs are allocated and what prices should ultimately be.
Sure, and I'm going to take that to Richard as well. I mean, as a company, obviously BP making decisions about where to put money. How do you see that sort of cost curve for these sort of technologies, sort of working out in that sort of slightly longer term?
I think there's probably two things we would say to that. I mean, one, the things like offshore wind, for example, the actual cash flow return is much more predictable than oil and gas. So you may make a lower margin on a year by year basis, but you've got a predictability about that cash flow and that return that isn't there in other parts of the industry, of our company and our sector. So that enables you to kind of work with that. There's definitely in offshore wind been a fairly rapid transition in reduction in cost, and as the offshore wind industry has grown globally, the cost per megawatt hour has come down considerably. And where we see in particular the need for kind of support is where you're bringing those technologies in early on. So if you look at Europe, the level of support for fixed wind has gone down quite a bit. Now, much of the support in Europe on fixed wind is more about providing kind of base prices rather than actually providing a significant uplift to the merchant price. But what we do see is, for example, with floating offshore wind, that is a technology that has huge potential to expand the sheer area that we can generate electricity from. But that will need further support, and it probably will need a higher level of support over the medium term to bring the costs for floating wind down to be more comparable to fixed. So I think governments can provide support in a number of different ways. Sometimes it's providing that stability. Sometimes it's providing a base where there is a genuine uplift in the return. Often that can be targeted towards technology development, technology build out, making that happen at scale with a very specific focus of enabling the overall cost of the technology to come down over time.
Sure. And Richard, I'm going to stick with you. We've got another question that sort of straddles that sort of international divide. But question from Hamish Penman: does CCS and by extension blue hydrogen face the same levels of opposition from environmental groups in the US as it does in the UK?
I probably can't comment on the US, to be honest. I don't know in detail, and I'd be speculating. I mean, people have different views on different technologies, and I think it was Dave that said there's a real opportunity for blue hydrogen to be a bridge. I mean, ultimately, green hydrogen has the potential to generate very low emissions. I don't think there's many technologies that have absolutely zero emission, particularly when you consider the steel, etc., that needs to go in to support. But blue hydrogen is definitely something that has a significant role to play. It does enable us to get through this bridging period. And I think by using CCUS technology, we can make sure we have the absolute minimum impact possible. And that's really what we want to do. And there are some sectors of the economy that are very difficult to decarbonize, something like steel, for example. And we will need probably to use hydrogen technologies there. They're not easy to electrify. And certainly the kind of temperatures, etc., that you need to achieve in steel manufacturing is going to require some form of combustion for a long way to come.
Sure. Matt, I'm gonna send this question to you. The question from Sylvia Garcia: relative to the workforce transferring from oil and gas to these new opportunities, do you think you see salaries translating as well, or do you think they're going to be different?
No, we do see a significant opportunity. There's very highly qualified people that have historically worked both in upstream oil and gas and in midstream that are easily transferable onto platforms like ours and future projects of the similar like. That wage scale, that compensation is very competitive and consistent with past practices, and frankly, we think represents, as some of the other panelists have alluded to, a significant opportunity to create more of a long-run kind of intrinsic employment associated with infrastructure build-out. That we think, again, we're kind of in the early days of this, but we think that represents more of a long-run dynamic in new geographies where a lot of these a lot of these jobs, weren't as focused for these skill sets, really starting in Houston and then branching out to, wherever the natural footprint of these projects are as they get developed. But yeah, we do believe that translates very well, and will grow over time.
Fantastic. We've got about 10 minutes to go, so I think at this point I'm gonna ask the panel to look a little bit further into the future and maybe take a bit of a punt about what might be coming down the line. I mean, I suppose say in 10 years' time, so it'll be 2031. Will we have hit that offshore wind target that you mentioned, Anders? Anders, in fact, let's start with you. What do you think will have happened in 10 years' time?
No, that's a good and interesting question, and I think obviously at that point our wind farms are powering millions of homes, and as we talked about on this panel, costs have declined, and hopefully ease of development on offshore wind, but I think also the other technologies have improved. A second topic I think is important is that then we are at the point where the supply chain is thriving even more than today, and obviously giving good paying jobs as we have talked about. And then through that, I hope that we've developed a workforce that also is able to feed back into the wider and the global industry through innovation, that actually what is happening in the US is also have the ability to affect how these technologies are employed abroad. So I hope that when we meet again, hopefully on a 10-year anniversary of this conference, that we have definitely succeeded in many of these areas, and particularly for offshore wind, that it's not something that we are talking about as something that is to come in a large scale, but it's actually here and now on a large scale, and we can go out on our boats and see them live.
Dave, I mean, hydrogen seems to be, moving at a fair old pace. I mean, I think there's a lot of interest still going on. I mean, looking ahead, sort of 10 years time, where do you think hydrogen's going to be?
So it's really interesting because 2 years ago to today already feels like the 10-year projections have happened, with who's involved, what kind of projects, and what kind of scales things are happening. I think that 10 years from now we have grandiose visions of significant numbers of vehicles on the road, especially around heavy duty and bus applications, for example. I think we're going to see hydrogen move from a local energy discussion to a regional energy discussion, and then move from a regional energy discussion more to a national and then an international scale as hydrogen starts to develop its legs and become more mobile from a national and global perspective. And those things are likely to start happening over the next decade. But I think that we still need to focus very much on the short term. With things growing exponentially, that trajectory is set today. Can we put in place today the policies that enable large-scale, low-carbon hydrogen production to happen? Because hydrogen production and that low-carbon, low-cost, and reliable is what's required and what's going to limit that growth at some point. So we need to make sure that we can make the investments today to enable the hydrogen production for tomorrow. If we are lagging behind in hydrogen production, these markets and these market possibilities will also lag, because you can't have the vehicles without the fuel. You can't have the impact on the grid and the natural gas infrastructure without having those assets for hydrogen production already in deployment.
Sure. And Dave, just to come back to you on one point, obviously in 10 years' time, do you think we will finally have solved that blue versus green hydrogen debate?
So I think it will have solved itself, right? I think that we know that we are going to need blue hydrogen to enable the transition, but we also know that the investments of the future are very much going to be built around new green hydrogen production. And so as more and more investment is made in green hydrogen, as the costs come down and down, we will see more and more of that in the market. At the same time, the only way to get where we need to as quickly and at a scale that we need is to start blue. And so we will see a transition to blue as green comes in, less and less future investment in new blue activities, for example.
And Liz, coming to you, what's your 10-year vision?
Sure. Well, we've been talking a lot during this conversation about carbon capture and storage, which is the easiest early technology there is known technology to capture the CO2 from industrial facilities, to transport it, and then to inject it underground. There is a history of doing that dating back to the use of CO2 in enhanced oil and gas recovery. I think what is coming next is the next phase of CCUS is the U in CCUS, and that is utilization technologies. There is a lot of effort being put into developing uses for CO2. And many of those applications are eligible for the Section 45Q credit. Now, it's a lower credit than is available for carbon capture and underground sequestration, but still a valuable credit. And what I mean by utilization is there is a lot of development being done about the ability to utilize CO2 in ways that secure it from release into the atmosphere long term, but also have value. There is technology developing to utilize CO2 in the cement production process that actually improves the process as well as reduces the net emissions from the cement manufacturing process, which it was mentioned earlier is one of the industries that is very difficult to decarbonize by relying on renewable power. Other ways that are being studied are capturing the CO2 and storing it in solid rock formations. That's akin to the secure geological storage, but there are ways to do it that it actually hardens and becomes part of the rock, which could possibly have future manufacturing implications. There is use of CO2 to grow algae, which can be converted into fuels. So I think really the opportunities are limitless. And really will expand as wide as the imagination of those who can develop the technologies. But I think that's really the next wave, is not just merely seeing CO2 as a waste product that is just to be put underground and stored securely for as long as possible, but to actually find productive use for the CO2 and create value for the CO2, which would be another incentive for industrial facilities to capture it and then potentially store it for use in these new technologies.
Sure. And Richard, what are your thoughts? And I suppose also, do you have any thoughts about potential sort of exports of knowledge or energy?
I think both of those are very, very much what we'd expect to see in 10 years' time. So the exports would probably be of two types. There's knowledge and professional services, whether that's engineering, whether that's consenting services. I think that's something that countries can develop quite quickly, and I'm sure the US will do that. You have a very, very strong pool, highly capable professionals in that area, and they will look to sell their services globally. And I think you can be very successful with that. And then, as we start seeing the scale of investments come through over the next kind of 3 to 5 years, that will bring the factories and that will bring the opportunities for other exports of physical hardware. Now, that's going to be very competitive. There is an existing European supply chain, supply chains in the Far East that will be wanting to compete there. But I'm sure there is space for US companies to be market leaders and to supply other parts of the world through that. I would say one of the other things that I hope to see is the connectivity between these three technologies really become reality. So hydrogen plants powered by offshore wind, the connection between CCUS and hydrogen being very much stronger. And so, my expectation in 10 years' time is that we don't talk about one of these technologies. We're talking about clusters where they're actually all working together. And that's probably going to bring the biggest reduction in CO2 emissions overall, which is what we all want to see.
Matt, final thoughts? 10 years' time?
Yeah, sure. I think, we certainly view the sequestration of the product and certainly the highest value of the 45Q tax credit incentive to do that as a solution, and we think can play a material role overall for CCS. I think as we look around the corner and as we talk to our customers, they're equally focused on the U and the intrinsic value, for the commodity itself outside of just kind of federal, or government incentives. So, we look at the opportunity to create new destination points for our customers, for demand sources, whether that's part of manufacturing processes, food processing, natural, bottling, et cetera, where there is a value ascribed to the underlying product such that our customers can achieve, the economic tent for participants in pipelines such as ours. And two, it creates both an incremental demand source for what is otherwise, just an emission with no inherent intrinsic value. So we're very focused on, step 1 is permanent sequestration, but step 2 through 10 is all about aligning, pipelines such as ours, where you have a large quantity of common quality CO2 with now demand for that very commodity.
Fantastic. And a final question to you, Stephen. What are your thoughts? The final prediction, 10 years down the line, what are we looking at?
Well, I think one thing that we will likely see is a change in the incentives that are being used to develop these resources. As I mentioned before, with offshore wind, other sort of new technologies, we see a lot of state support. I think what we're going to see is the markets evolving in a way where we're going to see things like carbon pricing become, a tool that is used to incent the development of offshore wind resources, other low emission resources, and as the market migrates in that direction, as the supply chains become more developed and costs come down, I think we may see some of these state programs, state support mechanisms, perhaps becoming less important, and a more market-based model that really is being used and takes into account sort of the preferences of the states for green energy.
Fantastic. And with that, I'm afraid I'm going to have to step in as we are out of time. I see that I've run 2 minutes over, so apologies for that. I'd like to say many thanks to our panel for sharing their time and expertise, and Bracewell for making this event possible. I'd also like to thank the audience for participating. I'm always very appreciative of your questions and your thoughts. I think there's been a lot to think about over the last hour and a half. So if you'd like to watch again, or if you want to share this with friends and colleagues, there will be a video on demand that will be available after the session has concluded. And I'd also encourage you to visit energyvoice.com, where you can bridge of new and old energy opportunities. And with that, and a final thanks from me, I'd like to say thank you and goodbye.